Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. R. Kelly is back in federal court. What charges the disgraced singer now faces out of Illinois? The deadly Rush shooting.
I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them, never.
Alec Baldwin says he did not pull the trigger. But does that match with the FBI's investigation? Controversial author Salman Rushdie is stabbed while speaking at an event. Now, his alleged attacker faces serious charges. And later, 2 former officers charged in the death of George Floyd are offered a plea deal ahead of their state trial. Law and Crime Daily, covering court cases from coast to coast. And welcome, everybody, to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Brian Ross, in tonight for Brian Buckmeyer. We begin with R. Kelly. Just weeks after a 30-year sentence was handed down to Kelly, jury selection begins in a separate federal trial for the disgraced singer. The 55-year-old now convicted sex offender faces 13 new federal charges in Illinois, including receiving child pornography, enticing minors into illegal sexual activity, and obstruction of justice. Back in 2008, Kelly was acquitted by a Cook County, Illinois jury for creating a video of himself having sex with a 14-year-old girl. At the time, the girl and her parents denied involvement. The alleged victim refused to testify. Federal prosecutors now say witnesses and their families were threatened and paid off in that case. This time around, prosecutors say the alleged victim and several other women allegedly victimized by Kelly will take the stand. Kelly maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty to the charges. His former manager, Daryl McVade, and former employee, Milton Brown, will also stand trial. The trial is expected to last for about 4 weeks. Last year, Kelly was found guilty on 9 counts of sex trafficking and racketeering in a separate federal trial. Back in June, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison by a federal judge in Brooklyn. Well, joining us now to talk about this, our law and crime legal analyst, Julie Redelman in Brooklyn, and Dr. Tracy Pearson in Los Angeles. Thank you both for being here. Dr. Pearson, let me start with you. Kelly was just sentenced to 30 years in prison by a federal judge in Brooklyn. Why does he now face a separate trial in Illinois?
Well, this is a case where one trial begets another trial. The thrust of this case really is obstruction of justice. Even though there are 5 victims who are expected to testify, and there are charges related to receiving and possessing child pornography, what we're looking at here is his involvement in obstructing the prior proceedings where he was acquitted, where there's allegations that he paid off and possibly instructed the victim to lie.
And Julie Redelman, let me ask you this. In that trial, Kelly was tried and acquitted as 2008 for creating this video of an alleged child pornography. How is it he can be tried again on the same charges? What about double jeopardy?
Because it's really not double jeopardy. The evidence here is different. The evidence here is less about the actual crime of the child pornography and more of what he did to influence that original trial. And the argument is that he tried to pay off and threaten potential witnesses on that case, and that's the reason that he walked away with an acquittal. And so therefore, double jeopardy does not apply. And now we're going to hear potentially from those witnesses who he allegedly threatened to see what they have to say in terms of this obstruction and tampering charge.
So their testimony will be about the alleged obstruction and the payoffs.
That is exactly right.
All right, Julie, Dr. Tracy Pearson, thank you. Stay with us. We'll get back to you in a bit. In California, a retired fire chief takes the stand on day 5 of the Kobe Bryant civil lawsuit. Vanessa Bryant, the wife of the late basketball star, brought the suit against Los Angeles County after officials allegedly shared photos of the deadly helicopter crash that killed her husband, her daughter Gianna, and 7 others. Bryant argues first responders took graphic photos at the crash site and then shared them with others outside the police and fire departments. Law and Crime West Coast reporter Megan Cuniff was in the courtroom on Monday when retired Fire Chief Captain Brian Jordan testified. Cuniff describes the testimony as unbelievable, saying Jordan at one point interrupted testimony, calling for a break in court.
He was at the scene the day of the crash, took photos. He's since retired from the fire department. He was basically forced into retirement over controversy over the photos, whether he was told to take them, whether he had any purpose to take them. He was combative on the stand, to say the least. He was his answers were Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very, very much like that. He denied even remembering being at the crash scene. He said he could not remember any photos of the crash scene, couldn't remember taking any photos, but he does remember, and he's very sure that he was told to take photos.
Also in celebrity legal news, Amber Heard hires a new legal team as attorney Elaine Bredhoff steps down. Bredhoff headed a team of attorneys who represented Heard in her defamation countersuit against ex-husband Johnny Depp. In June, a Virginia jury largely sided with Depp, awarding him $15 million in damages. Heard was awarded just $2 million for statements made by Depp's attorney. On Monday, First Amendment attorneys David Axelrod and J. Ward Brown announced they will now represent Heard. The pair recently made headlines for successfully representing the New York Times in a lawsuit brought against them by former vice presidential nominee Sarah Palin. In a statement, Heard's new team announced plans to find a way to reverse the judgment in Heard's case. Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, an acclaimed controversial author is in recovery after a stabbing attack leaves him in critical condition. But first, the deadly Rust shooting, what FBI forensic testing reveals about the prop-turned-murder weapon. And welcome back. Forensic testing now reveals the prop weapon used in the deadly Rust movie shooting could not have been fired without the trigger being pulled. In October 2021, actor Alec Baldwin held a prop weapon as he rehearsed a scene for the movie in New Mexico. The gun, which was loaded, it turns out, with live ammunition, went off. Cinematographer Helena Hutchins was shot and killed, and director Joel Souza was injured. While no one has been criminally charged in the shooting, New Mexico's Occupational Health and Safety Bureau fined the production company behind the film over firearms safety violations. Hutchins' family also sued Baldwin and the movie's producers. The FBI then conducted an accidental discharge test that determined the weapon could not fire without the pull of a trigger. Baldwin's attorney says the FBI's report is being misconstrued and that the weapon was in such poor condition, proper testing could not have been performed. All this comes months after Baldwin told ABC's Good Morning America he never pulled the trigger.
It wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled.
Well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them, never.
So, Julie Redelman, Baldwin maintains he did not pull the trigger, but the FBI report says a trigger had to be pulled for it to go off. What do we make of all this?
So many of us who follow this, especially those of us who have tried these cases involving weapons, had a hard time believing that the gun went off by itself. And so now we have at least confirmation from investigators that the gun did not go off by itself. And so when you ask yourself, well, who's telling the truth? Obviously we don't know. We haven't heard ourselves from the investigators, but we have to say there's one person who has the motive to not tell us the truth. There's someone who has an interest in potentially the outcome of the case. That's Alec Baldwin. That's not the investigators that are investigating this case. Now, regardless, I don't think anything's going to come of it, but certainly I think this weighs against Alec Baldwin's statement that he never pulled the trigger, in order for the gun to fire.
Well, Dr. Tracy Pearson, let me ask you this, following up on what Julie said. Could the FBI's newly released report lead to charges for Alec Baldwin, particularly if he testified under oath or told the FBI agents, which is a crime if you lie to the FBI?
Well, I'm going to give you my favorite lawyer answer, and that is it depends. In this situation, he may in fact have believed he was telling the truth, that he didn't pull the trigger. If there's evidence that corroborates that he did, then in fact, he may face charges for lying to the FBI. But more importantly, that FBI report is not yet out. That ballistics report is not public. And I want to be careful about characterizing it one way or another, because there is some information to suggest that that the weapon could only be tested once, and that it broke in half because it was in such poor condition. But there are folks that may in fact be looking at potential charges here besides Alec Baldwin.
Certainly more to come on that. Tracy and Julie, thank you so much. In California, the reward for information in the case of missing 16-year-old Kylie Rodney rises to $75,000. This as the search continues a week after the teenager disappeared. Rodney was last seen at a party with hundreds of other teens and young adults early last Saturday morning at a campground in the northern part of the state. Sheriff's officials say her 2013 Honda CR-V is also missing. Authorities say they've received more than 1,200 tips from the public. One of those tips fell flat this past Saturday when the FBI was investigating a potential burial site and instead dug up a dead dog. Officials have also released photos of clothing Rodney may have been wearing the night she disappeared, including a hoodie with the words "Odd Future" printed on it. They also say the last known ping from the teen's cell phone was around 12:30 in the morning, August 6, near a reservoir surrounding the campground site. Dive teams have been deployed to search the area, but so far they have not come up with anything at all. They are empty. Authorities continue to urge anyone who attended the party to come forward with any new leads.
We have one team, one mission, and one goal, and that is to find 16-year-old Kylie Rodney. We still are urging people in the community who may still be hesitant. You know, you're not going to get in trouble. All we want to know is, where is Kylie?
In other news, attorneys for American basketball player Brittany Griner file an appeal following her 9-year prison sentence in Russia over drug charges. The Phoenix Mercury player and two-time Olympic medalist was arrested in February at a Moscow airport after vape canisters containing cannabis oil were found in her luggage. Griner was in Russia playing for a women's basketball team during the WNBA off-season. She pleaded guilty to the drug charges but said she had no intention of breaking any laws. The trial continued despite the guilty plea, and Griner testified in her own defense, saying she was in a rush while packing and the cartridges ended up in her bag. A judge ultimately sentenced her to 9 years in prison, which some say is politically motivated. Griner's attorneys say in similar cases, defendants have received an average sentence of about 5 years, with a third of them being granted parole. Griner has 10 days to appeal after she was sentenced. The grounds of the appeal are not immediately clear. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, will 2 ex-Minnesota police officers involved in the death of George Floyd head to trial or accept a plea deal? Plus, investigators work to determine a motive in the stabbing attack of author Salman Rushdie. And welcome back. Iran now denies any involvement in the stabbing of Salman Rushdie as the controversial and acclaimed American author recovers from life-changing injuries. The 75-year-old author was set to give a presentation at the Chautauqua Institute in upstate New York last Friday when a man rushed the stage and began stabbing him. Staff and audience members later tackled the suspect, 24-year-old Hadi Matar, in an effort to detain him. Matar was later arrested and charged with attempted murder and assault. He appeared in court over the weekend where he pleaded not guilty to all charges. Right now, Matar is being held without bail as authorities work to determine a motive. If convicted on both counts, he faces more than 30 years behind bars. Rushdie's family says the author was taken off a ventilator this weekend, good news, but remained in critical condition for stab wounds in his neck and stomach, as well as puncture wounds to his eye, chest, and thigh. Rushdie has faced death threats for decades after his book, The Satanic Verses, made waves in Iran, where some considered it blasphemous against Islam. So Dr. Tracy Pearson, Matar's public defender, says he has no history of any violence or any past crimes. Were there any warning signs they could have looked for here?
There is some reporting, Brian, that his mother observed some behaviors that were concerning to her. He had paid a visit to Lebanon to visit his father. That visit didn't go well, apparently. And when he came back, his behavior had changed. He was no longer motivated, and he kept to himself. He was very socially isolated. When we're looking at risks, we're looking at people whose behavior changes over time. It changes markedly. And that doesn't mean that they're going to commit an act of violence. What it does is it offers an opportunity to ask more questions. It's better to say, I'm sorry, and apologize than to offer condolences.
All right. Julie Redelman, Rushdie received death threats for years after the publication of that book, a fatwa put on him by the Ayatollah. It even forced him into hiding at one point. I would know I've been at dinner parties where he's complained about too much security. So how do officials determine what threats to take seriously, and how could we learn from this attack, do you think, Julie?
It's a great question with not an easy answer. As Tracy discussed, it's hard. There were signs, but I'm not sure that there were signs that he was going to necessarily be violent towards this individual. One of the problems that seems to be in place is, they spoke to people at the actual event who said that the only thing you weren't allowed to bring in was food and drinks. So weapons were fine. And so it also sounded like there was no security and no one saw any visible security. So, even the most minor of protections were not put in place. And so it seems at the minimum, there should have been something in place to prevent someone from being able to come from the audience with a weapon and attack him the way they did.
But of course, as you know, when it goes on for so long, the person who needs the security gets tired of it.
Yeah, no, by the way, you're absolutely right. And there's a balance between what he wants and what's safe for everybody.
All right, thank you so much. Moving on now, in Florida, a Dorbart hearing is unexpectedly canceled after a weeks-long recess in the Parkland school shooting penalty phase trial. The hearing, meant to determine whether an expert's testimony is admissible in the trial, was expected to begin on Monday. That morning, defense attorneys notified the judge and prosecutors they will not present issues that were addressed in the Dorbart motions, first filed by prosecutors. Judge Elizabeth Scher set aside all week for the hearing that was expected to touch on the defendant's recent brain scans. Defense attorneys originally said the brain exam confirmed the gunman had brain damage. A status hearing is now scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. This comes after a week-long hiatus in the death penalty trial, where a Broward County jury will decide whether the defendant receives life in prison or is sentenced to death. On February 14, 2018, the gunman opened fire at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. 17 people were killed and 17 more injured. Last year, the gunman pleaded guilty to all charges. When we come back, the death of George Floyd. 2 ex-Minnesota police officers will head to trial this fall after they reject a plea deal.